People often believe that the biggest changes in a person's life arrive with noise. They imagine some unforgettable conversation, a dramatic ending, or a single decision powerful enough to divide everything into a clear before and after, but that isn't how the deepest changes happen. The deepest ones arrive without announcing themselves. They don't interrupt your life, they quietly become part of it. For a long time, I believed I understood myself completely, not because I had every answer, but because I had mapped the places within me that most people never reached. I knew where my limits existed. I knew which thoughts deserved attention and which deserved silence. I knew how to carry my own mind without asking anyone else to help me understand it. It wasn't loneliness. It was structure. Structure creates certainty. Certainty creates stability. And stability becomes something you begin protecting without realizing it. I spent years protecting mine, not by avoiding people, but by remaining slightly out of reach, close enough to be known, far enough to remain untouched. Most conversations ended exactly where I expected them to. People exchanged ideas, shared stories, offered opinions. Eventually, everyone returned to their own lives, carrying only the version of me that made sense from where they were standing. I never corrected them, not because they were wrong, because accuracy has always required more patience than most people are willing to give. Everyone sees through the shape of their own experiences. No one looks with completely empty hands. We all arrive carrying assumptions, expectations, definitions that were written long before we met the next person. I've done it too. So I stopped expecting perfect understanding from anyone. Life became simpler that way. You stop asking to be seen. You simply learn to exist. And strangely enough, that kind of acceptance brings peace. Until something interrupts it. Not with force, with precision. There are people who enter your life through conversation. Others arrive through circumstance. Some remain because history keeps pulling both of you back toward each other. But every once in a while, someone appears who doesn't seem to arrive through any obvious path. There isn't a clear beginning, no single memory where everything changed, just a quiet realization that their presence has become part of the way your mind moves. At first, you ignore it. You assume your attention is temporary, that your awareness will eventually settle back into familiar patterns. It usually does, except sometimes doesn't. Instead of fading, it becomes more natural, less noticeable, which is exactly what makes it impossible to recognize until it's already happened. One day you catch yourself looking at the world from an angle that wasn't there before. Not because your beliefs changed, because your perception expanded. The strange part is that nothing external appears different. The same streets exist, the same routines continue, the same mornings begin and end, yet something underneath every ordinary moment has shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. Like discovering another layer beneath a piece of music you've heard 100 times before. The melody hasn't changed. Your ability to hear it has. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. I tried to explain it logically. Maybe it was timing. Maybe I had simply reached a different stage of life. Maybe I was becoming more reflective. Every explanation sounded reasonable. None of them felt complete, because explanations often describe events. They don't always explain experiences. An experience changes the person having it. And once you're changed, old explanations stop fitting. That's what unsettled me, not uncertainty. Transformation. Transformation has a quiet way of questioning everything you believed was fixed. You begin noticing how many things inside you were habits rather than truths, how many conclusions were simply repeated often enough to become permanent, how many walls existed because you forgot why you built them. We rarely question structures that have protected us. Protection eventually disguises itself as identity. You start believing the walls are who you are. Maybe that's why change feels uncomfortable. Not because something new appears, because something old quietly disappears. I don't think people notice that happening often enough. We celebrate beginnings, we mourn endings, but we overlook the invisible adjustments taking place every ordinary day. The thought that changes your priorities, the conversation that quietly alters your perspective, the silence that teaches you more than 100 explanations ever could. None of those moments ask for recognition. They simply continue shaping you until one morning you realize you're no longer responding the way you used to. That realization carries an unexpected weight, because once you become aware of it, you can't return to being unaware. Awareness is irreversible. You can ignore it, distract yourself from it, pretend it doesn't matter, but it continues existing beneath every distraction, pot vent, unmoved, waiting for the moment you finally stop resisting what you already know. I used to believe clarity arrived all at once, as if one perfect thought could explain everything. Now I think clarity is assembled, piece by piece, moment by moment, almost invisibly. It grows through observation rather than certainty. That's why the quiet moments matter so much. People underestimate silence because nothing appears to happen inside it. In reality, silence is where the mind reorganizes itself. Words often describe who we were a few seconds ago. Silence reveals who we're becoming. I started paying attention to that difference, not intentionally. It simply became impossible not to notice. Certain conversations remained with me long after they ended, not because of what was said, because of what didn't need to be said. There is a rare kind of understanding that doesn't arrive through agreement, it arrives through recognition. Recognition asks for nothing, it doesn't demand proof, it doesn't require constant reassurance, it simply exists, steady, almost invisible, yet impossible to replace. That kind of recognition changes the way you listen. You stop waiting for impressive words. You begin noticing pauses, breathing, the space between ideas. Sometimes the most honest thing another person offers isn't their explanation. It's the moment before they decide whether they're willing to be understood. That moment is fragile. Most people rush past it. Some never notice it exists. But if you remain still long enough, you begin seeing people beyond the stories they've learned to tell. Everyone has a version of themselves designed for the world. Confident, capable, predictable. Then, beneath that, there's another version, the one carrying unanswered questions, private fears, dreams too delicate to speak carelessly. Most relationships never reach that layer, not because people are dishonest, because vulnerability requires a level of safety that's difficult to create. Trust isn't built through promises. It's built through consistency. Teeny moments repeated quietly over time, a conversation remembered, a silence respected, a boundary never crossed, simply because it could have been. Those things seem insignificant until you realize they're the foundation beneath everything meaningful. I've started believing that people don't change each other through grand gestures. They change each other through repeated presence, not constant presence, reliable presence. There's a difference. Anyone can appear during extraordinary moments. Very few remain quietly consistent during ordinary ones. And ordinary days reveal character better than extraordinary circumstances ever will. Life is mostly ordinary, which means who we become is decided there, not during milestones, not during celebrations, but during afternoons no one remembers, evenings that seem uneventful, conversations that never become stories. The extraordinary hides inside repetition. That's where I found myself changing. Not because someone asked me to, not because I intended to, because something inside me had become willing to see beyond the limits I once considered permanent. Looking back now, AB, don't think the important question was ever whether change would happen. It always does. The real question was whether I would recognize it while it was happening, or only after it had already become part of who I was. There comes a moment when you realize the person you've been trying to understand is no longer someone standing across from you. They've become part of the questions you're asking yourself. That's a different kind of realization. Most encounters leave memories, some leave lessons. A rare few leave new ways of seeing. And once your perspective changes, everything familiar begins revealing details you somehow overlooked before. The world doesn't become larger. Your attention does. I began noticing how much of life depends on what we choose to notice. Two people can stand in the same room, witness the same conversation, hear the same words, and walk away carrying entirely different realities. Neither one is necessarily wrong. They're simply seeing through different histories. Every experience we've ever had becomes another lens. Every disappointment adjusts the focus. Every hope changes the colors. Eventually, we stop seeing life as it is. We see it as we've been prepared to see it. That thought stayed with me for weeks. It made me wonder how many people I've misunderstood simply because I expected them to think the way I do. Maybe understanding isn't about finding people who agree with us. Maybe it's learning to recognize the architecture behind someone else's mind, not the conclusions, the process that creates them. Conclusions change. The process rarely does. Once you understand how someone arrives at their thoughts, disagreement becomes less threatening. Curiosity replaces judgment. Patience replaces certainty. You stop asking, why would they think that? You begin asking, what experiences made that thought feel true? Those are completely different questions. One searches for flaws. The other searches for context. Kangstigt has a remarkable ability to soften certainty. The older I become, the less interested I am in being right. I'd rather understand. Being right often ends conversations. Understanding keeps them alive. There is a strange comfort in admitting that another person carries an entire universe you'll never fully explore. It removes the pressure to define them, to summarize them, to reduce them into something convenient enough to fit inside your expectations. People are larger than their explanations. We forget that. Mostly because explanations feel complete, reality almost never is. I've watched people spend years protecting an identity they outgrew long ago, not because they wanted to remain the same, because change would require admitting they were never exactly who they believed themselves to be. That's difficult, not because it hurts. Because certainty is comfortable, questions are not. Questions leave empty spaces. And empty spaces when I catch myself becoming quieter than I used to be. Not because I have less to say, because I've learned that immediate reactions rarely reveal the deepest truth. Silence allows thoughts to settle. Only then can you tell which ideas belong to emotion and which belong to understanding. Emotion moves quickly. Understanding moves carefully. Neither one is wrong, but they lead to very different destinations. The world encourages speed, fast opinions, fast decisions, fast certainty. Yet the most important things I've ever discovered about myself arrived slowly, almost quietly. As if truth prefers patience over urgency, I've stopped fearing slow realizations. Some truths need time because they involve becoming someone capable of carrying them. Knowing something before you're ready often feels like confusion. The knowledge isn't incomplete. You are. Time finishes what information begins. That's why experience can never be replaced by explanation. Someone can describe the ocean perfectly. You'll still understand it differently after standing in front of it. Life works the same way. There are things no amount of thinking can substitute for living. I've become more careful with certainty, because certainty can quietly become arrogance without announcing itself. The moment we believe we've completely understood another person, we stop paying attention. Attention is one of the purest forms of respect. To truly notice another human being requires admitting there's always more left unseen. That admission keeps curiosity alive. Curiosity keeps compassion alive. Compassion keeps connection alive. Everything meaningful seems to grow from that simple willingness to keep looking, not searching for mistakes, reaching for truth. Truth doesn't always arrive looking impressive. Sometimes it appears inside an ordinary afternoon, a sentence spoken without realizing its importance, a quiet decision no one else notices, a moment where someone chooses honesty over comfort. Those moments rarely become headlines, yet they shape entire lives. I've begun measuring significance differently, not by volume, by permanence. Some events create enormous noise before disappearing without leaving anything behind. Other moments pass almost unnoticed and continue changing you for years. The quieter the lesson, longer it often remains. Maybe that's because profound change doesn't demand attention. It simply asks for honesty. Honesty with yourself first. Everything else comes afterward. I've realized that the hardest conversations we'll ever have aren't with other people. They're with the versions of ourselves we've carried for too long. The identities that once protected us, but now quietly limit us. Letting go of those versions doesn't feel like losing yourself. It feels like making room. Room for perspectives you once rejected. Room for people you never expected to understand. Room for possibilities your younger self would have considered impossible. Growth isn't replacing who you are. It's removing everything that prevented the deeper parts of you from being seen. That process never truly ends. Neither should it, because the moment we believe we've reached the final version of ourselves, we stop listening. And the moment we stop listening, we stop becoming. The more I paid attention to the way people moved through life, the more I realized that most of us are carrying conversations that no one else can hear. Not because we're hiding them, because some thoughts never become language. They exist somewhere deeper than words, shaping every decision we make without ever asking to be spoken aloud. I've wondered how many lives are changed by things that are never said. A silent act of kindness, a decision to stay instead of leaving, the choice to forgive without announcing it. None of these moments ask for recognition, yet they quietly alter the direction of someone's life. We're taught to measure importance by visibility, but the most influential parts of being human are almost always invisible. Trust cannot be seen, respect has no shape, understanding leaves no physical trace. And still, they carry more weight than anything we can hold in our hands. That realization changed the way I began looking at people. Instead of asking what they had accomplished, I became more interested in what they had survived. Not because hardship defines a person, but because it often reveals the values they refuse to abandon. Pain has a strange way of exposing priorities. When everything unnecessary falls away, what remains tells you far more than success ever could. I've met people who possessed extraordinary talent, but very little peace. I've also met people with ordinary lives who carried a quiet strength that transformed every room they entered. The difference wasn't intelligence, it wasn't experience, it was presence. Presence is difficult to describe because it isn't something a person performs, it's something they become. Some individuals speak constantly but never truly arrive. Others say very little, yet their attention changes the atmosphere around them. I've started believing that attention is one of the rarest gifts we can offer another person, not distracted attention, not attention divided between 100 thoughts. Complete attention, the kind that asks for nothing in return. That kind of attention reminds people they exist beyond their usefulness, beyond their achievements, beyond the image they've learned to present. For a few moments, they're simply allowed to be, and perhaps that's what everyone has been searching for all along. Not admiration, not approval, just a place where pretending is unnecessary. I don't think we're exhausted because life is difficult. I think we're exhausted because we're constantly managing versions of ourselves, the version expected at work, the version expected by family, the version expected by strangers. Eventually, we become so practiced at adapting that we forget which voice is actually ours. Rutsa covering it takes time. It requires quiet. It requires honesty that feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. I've had moments where I questioned whether I was becoming a different person. Looking back, I wasn't becoming someone new. I was becoming less afraid of being the person I'd always been. There's an important difference. Growth isn't always addition. Sometimes it's subtraction. You remove borrowed expectations, inherited fears, old definitions that no longer fit. What's left behind often feels unfamiliar at first. Not because it's false, because it's been waiting patiently beneath everything else. Life has an interesting habit of introducing people who unintentionally reveal those hidden parts of us, not by giving answers, by asking better questions. The right question can stay with you for years. It follows you into ordinary mornings. It appears while you're driving, walking, watching the rain fall against a window. Without realizing it, you begin living differently simply because your questions have changed. Questions shape attention, attention shapes choices, choices shape identity. Perhaps identity has never been something we discover. Perhaps it's something we slowly uncover by paying closer attention to the life we're already living. That thought made me more patient with myself. Not every season is meant for certainty. Some seasons exist only to teach observation. Others teach endurance. Others ask us to let go of things we spent years believing we couldn't live without. None of them last forever. Neither do we. Maybe that's why every moment deserves more care than we usually give it. One ordinary conversation might become someone's turning point. One sincere apology might end years of distance. One honest admission might become the beginning of a completely different life. We rarely recognize those moments while we're living them. Meaning often arrives after memory. Looking backward always creates patterns that weren't visible moving forward. Perhaps that's okay. Perhaps life was never meant to be understood in advance, only experienced honestly enough that understanding eventually finds us. I've stopped chasing certainty the way I once did. Certainty feels smaller now, less interesting. Curiosity leaves more room for growth. Wonder leaves more room for compassion, and compassion seems to reveal truths that logic alone cannot reach. Lott explains, compassion connects. Both matter, but connection is what gives knowledge a place to live. Without connection, understanding becomes information. With connection, it becomes wisdom. I've come to believe that wisdom isn't measured by how much someone knows. It's measured by what they choose to do with what they know. Knowledge can impress. Character transforms. Character is built quietly, no audience, no applause. Just thousands of ordinary decisions repeated until they become instinct. Every promise kept, every temptation resisted, every act of integrity no one else witnesses. Those moments accumulate. Eventually, they become the invisible foundation beneath a person's life. People notice the confidence. They rarely notice the discipline that created it. They admire the peace. They overlook the countless choices that protected it. Everything meaningful has roots hidden beneath the surface. Human beings are no different. The more deeply I look, the less interested I become in appearances. Dindif cannot be photographed. Integrity cannot be performed forever. Eventually, every life tells the truth about itself. Not through speeches, through patterns. Disbars never hurry. They simply continue until they become impossible to ignore. And maybe that's the most honest thing about being human. We become what we repeatedly choose. Long before we realize those choices are shaping us. Long before anyone else notices. Long before we find the words to explain who we've quietly become. By the time we understand the path we've been walking, it has already become part of us. And perhaps that was never something to fear. Perhaps it was always the beginning of becoming someone more real than we ever imagined possible.